Alrighty then. So hello, here we are again at our live stream. And you know, I could have done a little preview thing showing that I was going to be going live soon. I've been forgetting to do that lately. No big deal, I suppose. At any rate, I can derp around a little bit and see that everything's working. Sure seems to be. And people will start showing up, because people start showing up. So until that happens, I can just sort of chill and wait for my shift, my 2-hour shift of hanging out with my crew, as it were. Either that or I'm kind of like their crew, because I am the programming guy who is developing plugins for them and stuff, although I think they would think of themselves as my crew as well. Certainly when folks show up and they're like, hi, and I recognize their names, then that seems like it. I had a weird dream the other day, which had a cameo. Hey, Bo. I had a cameo from a guy who is part of the internet comedy troupe that I like. Internet comedy troupe is Loading Ready Run, and the guy who showed up in my dream is named Alex Stacy. And I just love this dude. He's awesome. But it's also interesting because he is a private kind of guy and very smart and doesn't necessarily have a lot of patience for like weird internet people showing up and being like, I'm your best friend forever because I love your work so much. And in this dream that I had, as I'll remind you again, this is a dream. Hilbert transform, not off the top of my head. Maybe you've already got something else for me to talk to other than random, somewhat pointless dreams. Let's talk about Hilbert transform some. But while you're preparing whatever explanation it is you have for what that means, because it might not be an audio-related thing. In this dream that I had, I showed up at a place because I was trying to seek refuge from a sort of social press of a lot of people around, only to find that this guy was there, and I recognized him. I was like, score! Coolest guy ever, and we're clearly both doing the same kind of thing. And I'm trying to think of something cool to say so that I can introduce myself as some person who's not just some random bullshit like, hey, you and me, we're similar. And I don't barely get a simple syllable into it before he's like, dude, seriously? And I realize he's like, I have no bandwidth for your parasocial stuff right now. And parasocial, of course, meaning like when you think you're somebody's friend because you've just seen them do stuff. Like if you've gone to a movie and like you think that you're really close friends with Chris Evans because you've seen him playing characters over and over. And there's another aspect of it, which is when people aren't actually carrying on conversations, but are watching a lot of somebody's social media output. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, I handled that about as well as I could have, because I acknowledged that, yeah, we're not best buds, even though we're doing the same, getting away from the press of excessive social interaction kind of thing. And also I'm a big fan. And then I'm like, but I'm still thinking of like a parting remark that would be cool and be like, oh yeah, they're my friends now. And I woke up with a neat idea for a kind of story that I want to tell, which is kind of cool. But also I got the remark, which was, Sorry, dude, but you're sort of the ink-relatable Hulk. So that was kind of funny. That was a weird little thing. I need to sleep less, clearly. Because if I sleep too long, I'm more likely to be able to have dreams and remember what they are and stuff. And if I go short on sleep, it means that that sort of thing is cut down a little bit. It's funny. It's weird sort of managing a strange and barely human brain at times. But I've got a bunch of years of experience at doing that at this point, so although I might not be looking like it quite as much as usual, you might have noticed, and especially in this light, I shaved really close because I'm trying to see what it's going to end up looking like if I just go totally clean shaven. So in this light, it looks like I just shaved everything completely off. And that's not actually true. In the last plugin video that I made, you can kind of see what I'll look like normally. But I might be moving in that direction just to see what that's like and stuff. Like I'm exploring looking older or having like a look of maturity or whatever, and I'm beginning to think like, I can get away with not doing that. Let's maybe not do that. So we'll see how that works out. So I think my cue is to look up some things about Hilbert transforms. And I also have a bunch of show and tell and things that I'm working on, and I can give you a full rundown on what it's going to mean that I now have developed a better biquad filter, because that's kind of a big deal, and it's going to have some nice positive effects on my plugin development, and you're going to see stuff coming out as along the lines of that. It is a pretty darn good way of processing audio within certain parameters, and having improved upon it is rather nice, although I've improved upon it in a fairly direct, in a couple of different ways. First of all, let me look this stuff up. Alrighty, so it is for signal processing. Sounds fair. Dum-de-dum. Here's a lot of bipple, 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 but it's not even telling me whether it's like a high pass or low pass or whatever. Seems like a very fancy piece of math. I have improved on the biquad filter, and I'll explain what that is after I finish looking at this Hilbert transform stuff, because you brought it up, and might as well have a look at that. It's not telling me much, honestly. This thing about the Hilbert transform, I'm not being given much in the way of even the loosest notion of what that would sound like as a thing. Here's a fellow who says that the Hilbert No. The Hilbert transform is not a product of a low-pass and high-pass signal. It is that the Hilbert transform of the product of a low-pass and high-pass signal with non-overlapping spectra is given by da-da-da-da-da-da. This still doesn't tell me anything. I'm not going to be able to do anything with this if I have no freaking idea what it does, or what it would sound like, or even what it does to numbers, because this isn't giving me the faintest hint of... Okay, so here's a discrete... Yeah, I am not sure if I'm going to need this bow, and I'll explain why. Because the thing is, I've finally gotten down the Wikipedia page to a place where it's like, this is a Hilbert transform with a frequency response band limited to the Nyquist frequency, and I can go to that page, and we've got a time thing, and I see how this can be incorporated as a finite impulse response filter of a peculiar kind, and they're giving it in terms of samples, and they're showing a little mock-up, and by looking at this, I can see what kind of thing this could be, but it doesn't look musically useful. Like, for people who don't have my screen, what Bo's done is given me a concept for a mathematical transform, and we'll sketch it out. And it's a mathematical transform that looks kind of like this, where time goes like this, and you have this increasing wiggle on a sample-by-sample basis that goes up to this maximum point and then swaps to the inverse, like this is negative and this is positive, and then decays away that way. Now, like this is a finite impulse response filter, but I don't see how it could be musically useful in any way because of several things about it. And I'm having more of a look at the Wikipedia here as to what else is going on. Like, there's one with a high pass, and the high pass is like this but flat. Like, you can do a high pass filter by making the Hilbert transform be a series of samples in your finite impulse response filter that go like this. And it makes sense that the low pass part of it would be this wiggle. That low pass part would be essentially the Nyquist frequency. And the closeness to the Nyquist frequency will relate to how far back this decay goes. Like, if you decay back about a minute or so, you can probably get a band limiting of almost the entire Nyquist frequency. Whereas if it's much shorter, then it starts rolling off at 2 Nyquist much quicker and with a slower curve. And it may have similar properties regarding the roll-off of the low-frequency part, like that would roll off much faster. But in the final analysis, what's going to happen to your audio as it's passing through this is your audio is going to get a big, massive DC swerve as it comes up to this point. And then you'll start getting the inverted DC swerve. And then on the output of, like, you'll have a spike. You'll have like a peak or a sound or something like that. So there will be this big DC swerve coming into it, especially if it is a fairly steep filter. And then on the output, the DC swerve will be the opposite. So yes, you can do this filter, and there's two things about it. One of them, it is based around doing this weird DC on one side and then past the central point it's DC on the other side. That seems to be the whole point of the filter. And two, it is linear phase, meaning that any sound that you make using a filter of this type, it's going to have a bunch of pre-ring. In fact, it'll have a pre-ring as long as the length of the filter, which if it's really long for a steep filter, that's going to be a lot of pre-ring. you can do this. It's going to sound like a digital filter no matter what else it might sound like. And it's going to have weird DC bumps depending upon how long the filter is. I don't know about the relevance of that guy. I'm still looking at this a little bit and trying to figure out, like, okay, so because it's a convolution impulse. You can do it with raw samples. You could do it with some kind of IIR or Fourier analysis. There's any number of things like we got. Oh, Bo has a link. Let's copy that location, and then I'll just take a moment and look at that, since this is the first thing you brought up. I've been derailed off of anything else I was going to talk about, and so I want to investigate this thoroughly. And boop. Formation of analytic signals. Signals that have been deprived of their negative frequency spectral content. A 281 coefficient FIR filter provides the central action in this DSP speech dynamic model, which illustrates how an analytic signal preserves dimensionality, reallocating negative frequency information to a quadrature time sequence. One problem: in DAWs and music, we don't have negative frequencies. All of our frequencies are positive. So that's interesting too. Gosh. Here's a dude saying it's a mathematical blockbuster. That's cool. Let me skip ahead to where it makes a sound. I'm try to see if it makes a sound. Dude's talking very heavy math. That's fine. He's definitely doing weird things with stuff. This doesn't make audio signals, man. There's nothing about this that suggests it's making audio signals. I do not know how you end up even getting negative signals. I can't do anything with this right now. So instead, I'll derail you right back. Check this out. Here is some more experimenting with the stuff that I'm doing. And I've got a series, remember last week I had this written up, and it was a list of signal processing things that you could do. I'm still experimenting with this kind of stuff. And one of the things that I did was take one of my notebooks and draw the color coding thing I had in mind and label these various chips with what kinds of inputs or outputs would be on those pins, because I wanted to see what types of pins would be surrounding these chips, and where you would, with the 4017 counter, there's a bunch of inputs that I've decided I can use yellow for that. And then the outputs are all, either on or off. They're gate outputs, and that would make them all red colored. So I'd be making a 4017 counter. And if you were tapping directly into those, you'd be color coding those particular outputs in red, and then also putting some kind of LED on them so you could see which ones were on. Trouble is, that would be out of sequence, because that one goes out of sequence. So what you do is you would make the side daemon out of it. So what I did was I took a little time, and it's not all going to be about hardware. I'll be telling you about the biquad filters I've been doing. But I'm just making these sketches in the attempts to come up with ways to wire up these little chips that I do actually have. And this is one where I have the parts that I would need for it. I've got the chip, I've got the switches, at least some of them. I got the lights, and I have these little pins. So how this would work is, and this is actual size, so that's kind of insane, i.e. it's really small. But here is one of the things that I could do with it is you got your chip here, and then the outputs are all going to each of these switches, and the switches are 4-position switches. And then there's a light on the edge which shows you like it's wired up. I drew sketches for where the wires would go, but then I would be just figuring it out, I think. And then these would be sequential. Top would be, it actually counts from 0 to 9. There are 10 steps in here. It would be going like that. And then these output pins below here, this would also be a light. And then the pins below would be where you take the output of the circuit. And these parts in this side are where you would have the input in. Like the one in the middle is a clock input. And the one on the top is a reset. And the one on the bottom is a clock inhibit. And then just below that is a carry out. So I'd be exposing all of the things in the chip. And then what you'd do is patch these little Bastel style cables, which are just experimenter board pins with 22 gauge pins that are kind of like phosphor bronze or something, so they're not wobbly. You'd poke those into the little holes in the cups, and this is taken from, in fact, I did an Instagram post showing the pin sockets. You'd poke those in there and say if you wanted to make it repeat at 8 instead of 10 steps, what you do is you would take presumably 9 or something and set it to one of the outputs, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you could use 4. So you take one of those pins and patch it to the reset input, and then set the number 8 to channel 4 with the switch, and it would immediately start cycling only in that. And then if you took like number 3 and set that to channel 4, it would be cycling only in number 3, pretty much on the fly. And this is what I'm going for with this kind of stuff. And the amusing thing about doing like this tiny stuff is that you could build it into a box this size, and it'd be like your miniature portable modular synth. And the perf board is relatively cheap, and these boxes are Hammond boxes that you would get for like guitar stomp boxes. This is a double size of a common guitar stomp box size. I'm not sure why they took to making it, but it fits strangely well with this notion of doing a weird little synthesizer. In fact, there are fun things you could do with it. Like, I could take this top lid and put another one of these on here, and then sort of bolt it on, and have a really skinny thing with maybe buttons or something to control. Excuse me. Or I could use little headers instead of these. These bolts come with the box, so you get those for the same $17 or so that the box costs. And if I got some additional headers with the same size bolt, which is 632, and just a little standoff, a little hexagonal bolt sticking up with another screw hole in it, you could put the bolt on there, and then they would just sort of be sticking out with a hole in the end. Do all of your hooking stuff up once you've got all of the chips mounted onto the surface of this and you're doing whatever. Then use the screws and bolt the lid on at whatever spacing the spacers have, and now it's transportable. And you can bolt the lid on with your little screwdriver and then throw it in some kind of case or throw it in a bag of yours and then carry it around. It's not perfect, but it sort of comes for free because you already have this piece if you get this. So that always kind of drags me. I always find myself wanting to fool around with that kind of thing. So I've made some sizes of circuit boards to fit with that. I know, I would like to make more weird little synthesizers for cheapo. I think I can do some very cool things, and if I started selling them at cost and designed them cleverly enough, I could be putting stuff together that you could A, play with for really, 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 really cheaply, and B, you could always wire it up in some different way if you wanted. So kind of like the Stompbox designer Devi Ever is known for making a lot of circuit boards where she can build several different stomp boxes of hers off of the one circuit board. There's like variations on the theme and a fairly consistent number of parts. And she tends to use the same bits, the same transistors, the same capacitors, things like that. I've also got some of these, which are little power jacks. And you could take that and sort of bolt it in on the side. And my thought of designing something like this was do as much as possible with the little sort of pin leads and things, because it's possible to get lots and lots of that stuff buying it in bulk. And then make it so that you'd sort of, if you had several of them, you could stack them on top of each other. And you'd have this sort of bank of ultra microscopic modular synths, and that would be quite amusing. So these are the things that I play with while not actually doing coding. Up to and including versions of playing with like this. I took I think a graphic converter actually, and sketched out a representation of that exact box in actual size so that I can sketch out some of the ideas. Because I've already done a thing where I took all of my spare graph paper, which this is graph paper. I already took it and cut it up into sizes that correspond to Eurorack. And the thing about Eurorack is it's cool and amazing and fun, and I really enjoy it, and I do intend to be designing and building some stuff for it. And this all applies just as much to that. Unfortunately, you have to start Eurorack by getting a Eurorack case, which can be, hundreds of dollars, until, oh, hey, RA Recordings, Rick. Until Behringer comes up with their Eurorack cases, which I'm sure they're going to do. And even then, you'll probably do better to get one of the more boutique Eurorack cases. Like mine is from Pittsburgh Modular, and I have every reason to believe it'll stand up to whatever I throw at it, which wouldn't necessarily... it's hard to say. I mean, one of the things... Behringer is following an Amazon strategy, which is interesting to see. It's also a little disturbing just because it's such a well-chosen move these days. What Behringer is doing with their stuff is they saw that, for instance, Korg was having some success making a little tiny analog gear. And Behringer's like, okay, we'll grab a bunch of IP as far as like Moogs and Rolands and things, which for whatever reason they're allowed to do, because they're being allowed to do this. So clearly that is, one is allowed to do that now. And they are going to attempt to dominate the market so much that you can't go anywhere else, which is what Amazon did. And in the modern day, this is one of the things that one does if you're a big company trying to be a bigger company, because that's the rules, is if they're a big company, they have to make themselves be a bigger company. These are the rules that I try to evade as a Patreon-backed creator, Patreon and or anything that turns up should Patreon itself bite it, which has not happened because they may be making themselves be the Amazon of like artist and creative payment processing, which would mean that anybody trying to be the alternative to Patreon would be kind of up against it. And that's one reason why I can never take it too seriously when you get like Jack Conte of Patreon going on about like, oh, this is not actually working because we're not going to be able to get enough income to satisfy the investors that we had. He's on record as saying stuff like that, but it's partly because the investors are unreasonable and want 10 times return on their money and stuff. And so that it becomes a weird world. But he's in the peculiar position of he doesn't want to be an evil corp, but he's in the scenario of sort of needing to become one in order to get a return on the investment funding that he got. So basically, if Patreon was smaller and less successful at what it was doing, it'd be possible for it to just sort of go bust because the investment people went, this sucks and you need to do this and the other thing and so on. And then he would be overruled or removed by the board or whatever it is that they've got. But Patreon is in a different position from that, which I'm not sure whether Jack understands. I hope that eventually he figures it out. Because his attitudes are pretty clear and pretty well established. Like him and Sam Yam founded the company, and his motivation was like, get a way for artists to get paid that's better than what YouTube is offering, because it's nonsense what YouTube is offering. And he's not wrong. And he remains this very like creative-minded guy with a lot of high ideals. And the ideals are not necessarily like giving right-wing nationalists platforms. So that becomes another issue. People freak out about Patreon. Oh, he's deplatforming people. And I've had people literally warn me, oh, be careful because he's going to deplatform you. And I'm like, do you understand that I'm a socialist? Do you understand how I'm living my life? How I'm, I'm not the political enemy of Patreon's people, pretty much anywhere in the world. So that's not really a thing, but it also represents that the guy running it has perspectives and points of view. And the question is whether he can be forced to drop that by the pressure of investors demanding massive returns on their things. And one thing about investors that you got to understand, when people are talking about Patreon deplatforming, and the idea is like, oh no, the Patreon deplatforming and all the investors are going to abandon them because it will be shown that they're morally bad and they're not. Investors don't care about free speech. They really don't. Investors with XOR, what the heck? Somebody's joking with me. I don't know what XOR Shift 32 is. The thing about that is that investors do not care about free speech. They do not care about human life. They don't care about any of those things. All they care about is whether the company that they're investing in is powerful and capable of throwing its weight around and basically bossing and pushing people around and making them comply to the company's will. As such, the whole deplatforming thing probably helped more than it hurt, because that whole sort of publicity flap was an indication that Patreon was willing to not just roll over and do whatever its users wanted. It was doing what some of the users wanted. I don't consider myself that much one of them, simply because I'm not that worried about like it needs to be able to... oh, now I know what XR shift is. I have good news for you, but that's going to come a little bit later. So to wrap up the idea from Patreon, Patreon is in the peculiar position of actually being an Amazon-type business, where anybody trying to replace it is going to be really up against it. And what that means is that he could just go on, like Patreon, rather than going away or being replaced by something, might just establish itself as being the Amazon thing. And I could see that as being future-proof. Not everybody agrees, and some people think like, oh, it's not going to completely fail because he is not making enough money to reward the investors so hugely. But it depends upon whether he's anchoring down that position of being the unreplaceable, part of the economy and that kind of thing. I think he's already got that going on. And anybody replacing him would be an absolute fool, because that's probably, I think he'd be more likely to stick with it if it was Jack running things rather than if they replaced it with who took over Tumblr? It was some terrible social media company taking over Tumblr. Point being, one of the things Patreon does is it allows me to not be coupled to the same, have to come up with hit things every week or every month or whatever. I don't have to be quite as tightly tied to this chasing the most popular thing. Which brings me to the next most popular thing, namely XR Shift 32. No, I'm fooling. Joku Sekovan? I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce your name. Probably Joku. You're probably Joku Sekovan, although I'm not positive. Could be Joku Sekovan, but I bet you're Joku Sekovan. In any case, I am updating the old plugins as I go. Because what I'm doing now is the new plugins, and you can look at the code and see for yourself. The new plugins use the random generation, which is not XOR Shift 32, but it's something that's even more primitive, I think. Maybe I forget. For the floating point dither. And it's using that variable for the input, which is the denormalization. So what you're asking there is I'm already answering by actively putting it into practice. So rather than using rand for the denormalization, for the newer plugins, I'm not using rand at all, anywhere. Instead, it's using what is in the floating point dither part. And since that is persistent, I can use that everywhere. Or everywhere that I can get away with it, but it's random enough that I can't get away with it, so I'm using it on the input as well. And that should be efficient enough to satisfy just about anybody. Question becomes whether I can really take that random generation and use it literally everywhere. Because I might be able to rehack a lot of different things that use randomization inside them to just use that value, which is going to be different every sample. And in some cases that'll work, and in some cases that'll be potentially a problem, because if it's starting off at a different number, it's not going to be as perfectly randomized as you might like. So if there's for instance, a stereo dither, I'm going to have to make sure that it's not exactly the same on each channel, because dither needs to be distinct for each channel. Stuff like that. Now, that should answer the question of, like, when am I going to update the plugins to make them go away from rand X. And I think what you'll find, I could probably look up when that went in. Would you like me to look up when that went into because let me see. I can look up a bunch of these things. For instance, I'll see whether I did it as recently as curve. And the answer would be curve is updated. So we can go back at least as early as curve. Let's see what else. That was 2 months ago. How about low pass 2? Did I have it in low pass 2? No, I did not. So between low pass 2 and curve, this went into action. I'm going to quickly look at the Airwindows website so that I can cross-reference with some of these things, and I'll come up with your answer. As far as the music streams on Tuesday, I'm enjoying the new lighting. In fact, I just put in shades, so I can get the room even darker for the lighting to work, and that should be fun. Let me check Brass Writer. That's what I'm doing right now, is looking these things up, because Joko Sakavan wants to use stuff that is not using rand in the denormalization code, on the grounds of it being too slow. Actually, I have been using rand in the renormalization code for ages, but that's beside the point. I think your music has improved since the lighting. Not that that's a compliment. Oh, it was that bad, dude. You gotta understand the reasons I do some of these things. I mean, I'd have to go way farther back to get to where I'm not using rand. Like this brass writer, which is not using the current floating point dither. And the current floating point dither is doing a very similar to XOR shift bit of math there. What I'm doing above, you want me to look for when it changed from rand to something else? Because that's, geez. Let me look way back at, say, drive or something. So I do have the floating point dither for all. Yes, Joku, I haven't been using rand at all. None of this uses rand. If you find that the other denormalization stuff, let me look back on here to see. Yeah, floating. Oh, okay. All right, so the original round of floating point dither was actually using rand. I stand corrected. It's the denormalization that is not using rand. So I guess what I need to do is go and find out at what stage it switched from that to the new version. And I can do that pretty effectively, I think. Let's have a quick look at Holt. Yep. So I'm going to tell you in stream and also type it into the stream the point at which it changed to the new formulation. And then you'll have a larger section than you thought as far as the stuff that I'm able to transition with. Let's see, was that Block Party maybe? I see Block Party. Yeah. Block Party is 4 months ago. So that was March 10th. You say 24th of January, huh? Let me have a look at Ditherfloat. Yeah, other plugins are going to come along, but that's a really enormous task. So everything is kind of happening in its own time. Ditherfloat. Let's see whether that is where. Yep. And then let me quickly have a look at Path Nutty. Huh, strangely no. Okay, if not Path Nutty, Holt and Cojones were next. See, what I'm doing is I'm looking up when this transitioned. Because Joko Sakovan needs the new version, which does not have the random thing. Yes, everything is going to update with the improved code. It's taking a while because lots of other stuff is happening. You know, among them, my brother having multiple strokes, so I've been visiting him and doing stuff like that. So human factors, unfortunately, get involved. It is literally just only me doing all this. And when it comes to updating hundreds of plugins, that tends to be a rather big thing. The updating of the original batch of plugins with floating point dither was such a huge undertaking that I kind of went splat after that, and I've been sort of following along afterwards. So Cojones, how about MV? However, I will have your answer. Give me a minute. Aha. So I think without any exceptions, sounds about right. Yep. So MV and after is high-speed floating point dither. And then I'm going to take another moment because there's a point at which I started using that for the denormalization, and that will really help you. Everything is going to further be edited so the denormalization uses that same random value. And those are going to be your real CPU gains, though this is more relevant to things like curve, which it does include that are let's see. I remember looking at low pass too, but I don't remember what it said. So we're going to go back and look at that again. But low pass 2 does not have that, although it's still a more efficient thing than Rand, but I can do a lot better. So what that means is, okay, let's have a look at smooth. That's between the two. This seems like a bit of a tangent, but in many ways this is the most relevant thing I could be doing in an Airwindows live stream, is looking up the information you need. So we'll do all of that. And smooth actually does not have the same, and curve does. So let's see whether recurve, maybe it's going to be recurve as the transition point. Dum-dum-dum. Bingo. So now let us go this is one of the reasons I knew I was going to have to include that calculation in all of the denormalization random factors as well. I've also been keeping an eye out for whether anybody popped up and went, oh my god, all of a sudden it doesn't work at all. What did you do? At which point I could change it without having to change literally everything. But that doesn't seem to have happened. So, 21 April. So, recurve and after, namely that's going to be recurve, curve, ResiQ, voice trick, DECRECA, Console 6, Podcast Deluxe, Remap, Podcast, DRes 2, and DHIS, and soon, what the hell did I call it? Oh, my poor brain. Those are all the highest speed ones. And if you want to fool around testing those, then by all means do so. If I have to change anything on them, easier to do it now than when I'm going through and probably by letters of the alphabet. Like I'm probably going to be doing that with like, okay, this is all the A's. And I'm also going to be doing that once I find a nice like high volume web hosting thing so that I can throw something on an Amazon instance and be like, here's new updates on this Amazon instance, go to town. But in the absence of that, this is all kind of continuing to unfold. Let's go back to first checking out that my stream is all working, and it is. I think people got bored when I was looking up things, but I was looking up things for a good reason, so it's all fine. This is a stream where it's not all that much of a concern as to what kind of viewership I get. More, it's like if people are showing up, then I should be serving them. So that's the idea. To the extent that that even makes sense, because part of it is like, oh, hey, look at these ideas I want to incorporate in like raw CMOS chips. And that is not necessarily the same thing that people are doing as far as the plugins are concerned. It just happens to be something that's super interesting to me, so I'll be pursuing it. So, Biquad. That's the new thing coming out. That's been most of my work for the last couple of weeks. It's like this. Biquad filters are a very common kind of filtering. And when people say, like, oh yeah, you're not your normal DAW filter, as in boring, lame sounding, unpleasant, sounds very digital, it makes things sound flat, you don't want it, you want to get somebody's special custom filter instead, generally what they're talking about is biquad filters. That's generally what you've got as far as just raw audio cookbook stuff for several reasons. Here is one of them. A biquad filter is kind of like a block diagram like this. Oh, how long did it go to the chat start? The chat started pretty accurately at 11, which is about 55 minutes ago. So that's how long it started. Biquad is kind of like this. Samples come in, samples go out. What this is delays. And you can configure it in a variety of different ways, but the bottom line is this. You're keeping a set of delays of the input stuff. So this is last sample's input, and then this is the last sample before's input. And you're also keeping another delay of the output stuff. This is the last sample's output, and this is the sample before that's output. And the reason it's called biquad is because the math is like a bunch of complicated stuff, where this is on one side of, this is a quadratic equation on one side of dividing, and this is another quadratic equation on the other side of dividing, and this is your result that equals whatever your result is. So you solve these quadratic equations on either side of the dividing, and then you get your result, and this is the number that becomes output. Now, quadratic equation basically equals like math. So what you can do is work out the way the biquad works, the way that it does all of the things that it does, is you've got this stream of samples coming through. And as they are coming through, oh, Joku, I'll do it. I'm doing it. If anybody thinks they can do that, they're welcome to try. The code is out there. It's kind of my job. It's what I'm getting paid to do. I'm getting paid to do that and also release a new plugin that's hopefully amazing sounding and revolutionary every week. So that's kind of a lot, and it's also kind of a lot for getting paid barely over minimum wage. So this is a comfortable lifestyle, but it keeps me busy, and that's why I haven't updated all the plugs. It's just only me. So if anybody feels they can do that, they're going to be up against it as far as like filing on GitHub like 1 million pull requests or whatever, because that would be messy, and I'm not sure how well that's going to work. But if you think you can get somebody else to do that, then go right ahead, because it's going to be a bear. It would cost thousands upon thousands of dollars to hire somebody to do that, even if they were up to it and able to like translate everything relevantly and stuff. It sounds like your need for all of that stuff is way more pressing than I had anticipated. It sounds like you desperately need me to go and update all of these things. I'm not sure it's quite at the level of drop everything, don't sleep, don't eat, drink nothing but coffee, and do it all. I do know that I can't make myself sick. My brother is already having problems with strokes, and I can't go that way. One of the reasons I'm protecting myself from things like strokes and heart attacks is sometimes taking a little more of a chill attitude towards some of this stuff because the scope of the task facing me is so huge. There's hundreds upon hundreds of plugins, all of which need to be updated. And even when I've done a lot of the work and I know what to do, it's still a lot going on. And if I only do that, I could go and start doing, like, this is the update with the new dither this week. Or this is the update with the new dither for all plugins starting with A this week. And I could do that, and that would leave me not producing any new sound plugins, any new ideas for months. And I don't think I can do that. I don't think that's going to work. So I'll do the best I can. What I'm seeing here is that you're really freaking out about not having the latest in floating point dither, and there's probably performance reasons for that, like the mixes that you're normally working with, anything that's including RAND or whatever, which does lead me to ask, how are you able to use anybody else's plugins? Mine are more efficient than most, but it sounds as if your need for the updates is getting really pressing, and I'll bear that in mind. Like, I am humbled by the intensity with which some folks need the maximum performance that I can put out, because it didn't really, this didn't make that big of an impression upon me because nobody has been talking about that for ages. I haven't heard anybody talking about CPU performance for months and months and months. For a lot of people, it's all fine. But then for a lot of people, they're able to run like 2019 era modern grade plugins, and a lot of that stuff is just going to choke your machine completely. So that is another argument for why I'm needed for doing this. So all good. I think we're all on the same page. Back to biquads, seeing as this is what's coming out next week rather than all the plugins being updated. So how a biquad works is fairly easy. How you calculate it is a little more hard. What happens is you got your stream of samples coming in, and it's keeping like a couple instances of samples. Like, it's keeping the last sample here, and it's keeping the sample before that here, and then it's keeping the last output sample, which is changed there, and keeping the last before that. So it's a delayed time of 2. And oh, Joku, don't be sorry. People are freaking out about I take this stuff seriously. That's why I get paid to do it. There's any number of people trying to do the kind of stuff that I do that will never even begin to get a foothold. I'm kind of in the position of Patreon and Amazon there, which it's like, okay, I'm sitting here, good luck doing what I'm doing as, like, the replacement Chris from Airwindows, because I'm kind of taking up all the oxygen in the room. And that means I need to do this stuff. So, all like I have to honor Joku's need for more efficient things because A, I can do it. B, you're not going to be able to get another programmer to update all the plugins this way. They're going to look at the size of the project and be like, ha, 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 yeah, pay me lots of money. And C, there's not going to be a new person coming in to do this. Even if I decided, like, I feel really bored, I'm not going to do anything ever again. It would take forever for somebody else to show up because I'm taking up all the sort of PR and occupying that space very thoroughly. Back to the biquad, because this is also occupying the space very thoroughly. So, samples, delay units. How you make a biquad is you go, okay, the output is the input sample times this, plus last input sample times something else, plus the one before that times something else again. Oh, and also the output sample times something again, plus the other output sample, one before that, times something else again. So all the biquad kernel is a convolution reverb. It's a delay box. It's a double delay box What it's doing is it's doing two echoes. One is one sample ago. One is two samples ago. And then it's also doing two regenerating echoes, which is like there's feedback in these ones. One is one sample ago. One is two samples ago. You could have this be like 100 samples ago and 200 samples ago, and 300 and 400. And then these are outputs, so these would feed back, and these would not. But that's all it is. A biquad kernel is nothing but like 4 delay taps of various kinds. 2 of them not regenerating, not being feedback, and 2 of them having feedback. Which brings us to the upgrades. Now, I'd had a lot of trouble because I have repeatedly tried to do this. Because again, it's easy to do the kernel. It's not necessarily easy to come up with the parameters if you don't have the math. And I'm a college dropout. I'm like your Steve Jobsy type. And big ideas, hopefully good taste in sounds and things. But when it comes to quadratic equations, I really don't understand what that stuff is about. Maybe I can gradually learn, but it would take time, and I'm working very fast on things, so I don't often get time to dig into that kind of stuff. And doing these numbers involves a lot of stuff like quadratic equations and sine functions and cosine functions and things like that. And I had previously found people doing biquad stuff, and you can look up coefficients. In fact, I have a plugin coming out that is going to come out basically on the grounds of it being a retro plugin, because one of the plugins coming out is Bass Drive. And what Bass Drive is a long time ago, and it's a secret weapon for many people, because they're like, this is absolutely astonishing, amazing, and from the dawn of time, and nobody knows about it. Bass Drive was a EQ built up out of biquad bandpass filters with distortion on them. Like, Bass Drive gave this really grungy kind of amp-like quality. And the filters, it's one of those ones from long ago enough that I was doing research and studying other kinds of products. This was not modeled after a plugin. This was modeled after a piece of hardware that I had, namely a SansAmp Bass DI. So Bass Drive is like a SansAmp Bass DI, slightly different. It's not really meant to be exactly like, but I tried to choose the same frequency bands. And that's not a graphic EQ or a parametric EQ all that much. It kind of is you could set it flat, but Bass Drive is really kind of about making extreme aggressive tonalities and stuff. And it was quite good at that. Thing is, back in the day, I didn't really have this stuff mastered. Oh no, I come up with a plugin a week. Monitorium has learning about Airwindows by the minute. Go and look at airwindows.com and look down the side, and you'll see which plugin I released in whichever week, and you'll see how they go. And then if you download new updates.zip, you can have all of them, because that's how I roll. And then if you find ones that you would have bought, yeah, I'm reissuing old work, but the old work was never VST. So I'm having to report everything and often adapt it or improve it a little bit. Just about everything is getting like the like floating point dither now and denormalization code, because the AUs didn't need it so much and the VSTs sometimes really need it. Anyways, let me drink more coffee. I'm losing track of things too easily. Biquad filters also have another thing going on. Note this. I began this stream by looking into some complicated Hilbert transform, which basically looked like that, where the samples, it started to do larger and larger samples, and you could make them oscillate like this for a high pass effect, or just go straight and then swap polarities like this for a low pass effect. And this would create big low frequency thumpings in various directions. So there's a lot non-desirable about that. But that's also an FIR filter. An FIR filter means finite impulse response. It means you have all of these to make up your filter, and the filter works as if it is a convolution reverb. The convolution reverb aspect is if you had the set of samples that you're using, and instead it did this, like big noise. This is basically a sample of a gunshot or something in an acoustic place. Boom, loud noise, reverberation, and then it gradually dies away. Within this context, within this size of a FIR filter, then that makes a reverb effect. If you had the same length of a sample arrangement, and instead it's sort of vibrating back and forth up to a certain point at the center and then back down again, that becomes a low-pass filter with a very, very steep cutoff. Because the longer you stretch out an FIR filter, like, 200 samples, 1,000 samples, 10,000 samples, you can calculate it in such a way that you get an incredibly sharp cutoff or anything else that you want. And the math is just in where the samples are placed, but it still acts the same way. And there's two problems with that. One, the latency of getting the middle of your FIR filter is exactly as long as the length of the decay. Like if your reverb impulse would go and it was 2 seconds, and you did a FIR filter that used up that full 2 seconds, you'd be able to have an incredibly steep cutoff, but the middle of your filter is at 1 second. So you have a latency of 1 second always, no matter what. And that's kind of lame. And the other thing that's kind of lame is with the FIR filter, it decays away in both directions. It's linear phase. And what that means is if you have a sound coming up that's being affected by the filter and the filter has a tonality to it, half of that tonality is going to build up to the active part of the sound. It's a little sort of blur, and the blur is not just a matter of decay, like a acoustic event or a speaker reproducing things. The blur is also a pre-blur coming up. It's pre-ringing is what they call it. And FIR filters that are linear phase will always have that going on. So I'm not a fan of those. But hey, check it out. Biquads. Foop. It's nothing but this little delay thing, and all of these delayed taps are behind the initial sound. So the biquad can have zero latency. The biquad can do whatever you want. It might, the tonality of it might be slightly blurred a little bit. Oh, Joku points out correctly, I think, that you could just go like this. This is also a FIR filter. And it acts kind of like the reverb impulse, but it's just a waveform. Typically, it'll be like a sine wave at a given frequency. And if you do that and stretch it out as long as you want, then you will also have a FIR filter. And it will be a steep cutoff. And it will fail to have a latency. And it will, there's a lot of stuff. In fact, this is how ResiQ was designed. ResiQ uses this concept. And what it does is it has the initial part of the attack at a slightly different curve rather than being literally only the onset of a sine. Because if you started at the top here, you're going to be including a lot of other frequencies. You have to start your impulse response made of this at 0, and ResiQ accelerates up at twice the rate, and then transitions to the sine wave, which then decays. So this is what Joku was talking about. You do not necessarily have to have big latency on an FIR filter. But this although it's a filter, it now has really weird phase response. So people don't often go for FIR filters that basically just work like reverb impulses. The biquad, you don't need to do that because it is already just delay taps. And it would be represented like if it was this on this, much like the delay taps would be like that, it'd be like a little block about this big, and then the fact that it has regeneration, the fact that it has echoes that persist, cause it to sort of decay outwards a little bit afterwards. But the active parts of it are functioning within this little context. Here's the thing, and maybe you can see where I'm going with this. Like, my initial experiments with biquads did not work out because while I could find stuff, like I found stuff online, and I think that the bass drive thing was actually using this. There's a guy who has a online biquad filter parameter generator, and you can type it into his web page. You say, this is the frequency response. We'll say we're running at 44.1K, and we can do this resonance and this thing and this, that. Type that stuff into his web page, and it will spit out the parameters that you use for these things. And I did that. Hey, Tony, I'll see you when you get it back in next. Tony is another regular on the stream. The webpage will give you the parameters for these things, and that's basically how I did bass drive. Is I ran it at 44.1K, and I said, give me the parameters for these different things. And I kind of just like experimented with them and figured out what it was that I wanted. And then I went, okay, give me the numbers for this, and I'll just make it work. And I sort of did a hard-coded biquad thing that's very cumbersome, and like when I release it, you'll see what's in the code, or if you look at the code, you'll see it. And it was very much longhand and very cumbersome. And people don't normally code stuff that way. And I did make it work, but it wasn't configurable. Like, I couldn't just have it recalculate if you're at a different sample rate, because I was stuck with whatever coefficients it was. I was plugging in the sample rate from the start. So it was sort of one of my old plugins that didn't adapt to new sample rates very well. The guy's code was available from that web page, but that guy's code was GPL. GPL is GNU General Public License. If you use GNU General Public License, it's open source. In fact, it's full-on free software. So you can use it if all your other code connected to what it is that you're using is also GPL. I'm not using GPL, I'm using the MIT license. The MIT license is more lenient than GPL, in that if I do MIT license, people who are using GPL can just use that stuff. They get to use it completely, but I don't get to use GPL stuff in my MIT license stuff without switching over to GPL completely. And since I've designed things in such a way that I feel it needs to be more flexible to basically exploitation, I'm working in the same world that has like Amazon and big record companies and Patreon and so on. And this is just my calculation for how things need to work, that I think that my thing can continue to expand or become more important and even be influential and allow other stuff to happen like it, if it itself gets to be exploited pretty freely. So my choice of the MIT license means that other companies can do things like make plugin generating toolkits, which several people are trying to do, I think, where they can release the resulting products as GPL, or they can release the resulting products as MIT, or they can release the resulting products as pay for this commercial software license, as long as they credit me which I believe they're all doing. The folks that are doing this are crediting me. And because of the MIT license, they get to do that. If I was using the GPL, it would not be legal for them to do that unless all of their stuff was also GPL. The upshot of that was I couldn't use the guy's code. And I tried to learn the lessons from how the code was done and write code of my own from scratch that not only did this, but also did the calculations of the things. And it had to be different, and I had to make it up based on my understanding of how that math was working. And I tried that at least 3 times, and wrote my own code from scratch, got it all together, because I couldn't copy the GPL stuff and just use that. Instead, I had to rewrite it, much like Stallman did when he was working. Richard Stallman, the guy who was inventing the GPL, did it based on what they were doing with Lisp machines, which is a kind of computer, back in the day. And he had access to a commercial company's work that were making these machines, and he thought that was just very bad that they were making some of this stuff commercial that he felt was just hacker expression of ideas and freedom, and you should be able to develop this programming language, which is Lisp, freely, and everybody should share their ideas, and they weren't doing that. Instead, they were releasing commercial software, and he was legally barred from using the code that they did, even though they were the same people he'd been hanging out with in school. So what he did was he got access to the code so that he could see, he would be able to see, this is what the new code is. This is what the new features are. He got access to the code, so it's this is how they did it. And then he was and I have to re-implement everything with entirely original code that does the same thing, but is done in a completely unique and different way, so it's not the code that is clean room disassembly kind of black boxing it kind of thing. Basically, he had to do it all different, which he did for years and years, I think. And I'm no Richard Stallman. I was not able to do a black box reimplementation of biquad filters and their quadratic equations from scratch, just basically knowing the general concept of what it was. I don't have the math for it. I wasn't able to do it. And then I came across somebody who had another set of biquad type stuff after yet another attempt to do it and failing, where it would just break. And if a biquad, if you do the biquad wrong and it breaks, what happens is you run the program, you cut the plugin in, and boop, the output immediately goes to negative or positive infinity, and it just goes pfut, and then you have no output. It's just stuck. The variables have gone to infinity and they're dead, and it doesn't work. Turns out there was somebody else who did a biquad and biquad coefficient generator that was not GPL'd. Instead, it was literally public domain. Go ahead and use this, credited or not kind of thing. So what I did was I went with that and did the same basic concept. I was I want to alter this until it's mine. I want to alter this until it's the Airwindows biquad and not an exact copy of this for a variety of reasons. And one of them was I didn't like the way people were doing these things. They were doing these things in this very C++ kind of way, where it's okay, here's the biquad, and then you call this function to set this, and you call this function to set the queue, and then you call this function to do the thing like that. And it's you're making this overcomplicated. This is not this is like a little delay tank with the regeneration. And then the setting of the coefficients, you should be able to just do that fairly directly without all this making C++ classes of everything. So I wanted to change it. This time I was able to start from essentially, never quite literally, but essentially since it was public domain code, I was able to copy paste it. And I didn't literally copy paste it, but I took the guts of how that code worked and started with something that was what was already there. First of all, I just took the guts of it, copied it over, and was like, does this actually work? And I ran it, and it did. And then I'd be changing other things, like, okay, how do I take this thing out of the class that is setting the resonance or something? I want it to just be this little bitty equation with a comment in there saying, this bit is the resonance, change this for this. And I would periodically change that, change the other. One of the things that I did was, rather than making a class where you instantiate other classes of classes to do the thing, I took it and I set it up so that the numbers we're dealing with, namely the multipliers for these things and the delayed samples and stuff, just all sat in a little array. I would go biquad, let's see, I think my initial one in mono. I would go, okay, biquad 9. And I decided that it was kind of like using classes, except for with less syntactical stuff. Just like, remember, this is what this is. And biquad 0 was the frequency of the filter. And biquad 1 was the resonance. And bearing in mind that if we're running this, we're getting to recalculate it all we want, so we don't have to note down what the sample rate is. As we run it, we'll look that up and recalculate it on the fly. And biquad 3 is, this multiplier. Biquad 4 is this multiplier. Biquad 8 is the delayed sample, and biquad 9 is this other delayed sample, and so on. And then I redid the kernel of it so that it was using these array things, this like biquad something equals whatever. I made them all long doubles, because one of the things that happens with biquads is if you're doing too weird of a algorithm, it starts running into problems. Like if you're doing, I think maybe a super low frequency. I'm not sure whether it's super low or super high frequency, maybe both. But if you're doing a frequency that's really tough for it to handle, then what can happen is if you're using just floats for the numbers, it'll start giving you bad results. Like the variable will sort of swing off in the wrong direction, or you'll start getting DC effects or artifacts or something like that. And obviously my take on that is like, okay, let's not use floats. And you can use doubles. And I was like, well, let's use long doubles and see whether it still works. And I used long doubles and it still worked. So it is a durable IIR filter where you can apply some pretty freaky parameters and it's still going to be able to calculate it out without making mistakes. Because that's the thing about a biquad filter. These algorithms, the quadratic equations involved with that, can generate numbers where, it's dividing by this or multiplying by that or cosine of the other. If you're picking frequencies that are too far out or resonances that are too crazy, it can generate outputs where the audio will break. And because of the resolution limits of floating point numbers. And of course, I'm all about that. So that's one way of improving the biquad from what it already is. And the funny thing about that, and I think it also improves the tonality of it, because of course, you don't necessarily, it's not just a fixed point where it's like, okay, once you get to this frequency, all of a sudden it's completely broken, everything else is fine. No. If you're doing biquads and you have that capacity where, because of these algorithms, you set like a resonant frequency of 50 or something, a Q of 50, and it's producing output which just breaks and goes wrong, because the resolution of the floating point numbers is not enough and the errors involved in it are producing a large enough effect that the output of the plugin is broken and no longer works. What that means is taking it a little bit farther down from that to where it hasn't really broken yet, you're still getting that problem. And I think this is one of the reasons that Cookbook Audio DSP and, standard DAW EQs and things are considered to sound bad. What's happening is people are using algorithms that are sensitive to this stuff and then doing nothing to help. Like, they're using algorithms where if you use enough of a frequency or resonance or whatever, that it actually breaks to the point where people have to figure out ways of dealing with this. And they figure out various ways of getting around it. They figure out, like, I think there's a number of approaches to dealing with the problems of processing biquad filters using floats. And nobody seems to have thought of just using higher higher resolution variables. Go figure. But they're probably partly because there's a lot of DSP that you can get, like literal hardware that's designed to just use floats. And that's all you can have. So they do have to work out ways of going like, well, what if I want a cube of 50 on this embedded processor that only understands floats? And that's when they have to come up with an alternate way of dealing with it. But we're in DAWs and we can use long doubles, so we can do that. Here's the other thing where I'm going to get to as far as, because in adapting this thing from the public domain code and redesigning it completely until it really bears no traces of that anymore, instead it's all based around this array of biquad values. And I'm talking about this because this is going to be code that people can grab off my website and build their own stuff out of, using the Airwindows approach to it. And it's not only in terms of sound quality, it's in terms of design and ways that you can involve doing this that's a little more direct and less making all classes of everything. I've got it all built into this array. So the array contains all the variables. The stereo array includes like 11 instead of 9, because the stereo array also has to have delayed samples for both left and right channels. And I'll be including a AU build in stereo simply because, and the plugins won't include that AU build in stereo because functionally it'll be the same. But in terms of the code, I'm including an AU build in stereo so that if you want to build a stereo plugin that uses biquads, you have just copy and paste code that'll be really convenient. Because one of the things about this is you don't need to have stereo coefficients. The stereo can just be like biquad 9 things in the array, only 11 things in the array for the additional stereo delay taps, because all the coefficient stuff is likely to be the same. Other than for people who are like, all of my frequencies should be slightly different from channel to channel because that's what analog means, and I never buy into that. But you'd be able to do that if you wanted. I just think it's important to offer the capacity to not have to. Here's where things get interesting. So we got our biquad filter. That says biquad, so let me fix that. We got our biquad filter. It looks like this inside. What do you think would be the next obvious thing to do with this that would make it sound amazing? And the answer is fairly simple. It's a delay. You sandwich it with console, and then you get a console IIR filter, which is something we've been able to do all this time, but not in such a way that I was controlling how the biquad filter was actually implemented. So we've always been able to take, say, console channel and instantiate that, and then do like logic channel EQ or something, which is biquad based, and then do console bus after that. Or indeed, I used to have like console 4, for instance, I had bus colors for set up so that you could involve that. And what that would do is let you do a tone quality thing. And it was replacing console channel. And then the tone quality thing from bus colors would go into the filter, which is still just the logic. It's still just a biquad filter or a complicated series of biquad filters. Because here's another thing about them is biquads, you get a variety of different things. And I chose 4 of them, if I remember correctly, to focus on. And then there's also so here's the ones that I focused on. This would be a low pass filter. Frequency goes up and then it cuts off. Frequency is the point where it transitions from pass band to stop band, and Q is how fast it goes. If you pick a Q of 0.7071, and I think that might have to do with the math constant, so I think I can add more decimal places onto that. But that is a Butterworth filter. Butterworth means you're using a Q of exactly 0.7071, because that's where it starts to roll off without giving a bump of resonant frequency. When you use steeper Qs on a low-pass filter, you're still going to have the flat passband, and it's still going to roll off, but it will bump upwards a little bit in a resonant peak, and then it'll roll off faster. And you control all of this with just these. It's all the same. So it's a very neat little trick to use these. Then you've got your high-pass filter, meaning that you start at a low frequency, and then at a certain point you start getting signal, and then you get a pass band all the way through to the Nyquist frequency. And again, the speed which it transitions is the resonant frequency, and 0.07071 is Butterworth, and that means it's the one where it doesn't have a resonance bump. People sometimes get worked up about these things. Like you can, a plugin designer that I've seen doing recent work, I think it was actually the Nebula guys in some way. Somebody's library was causing a ripple effect. It was causing sort of, before it cut off, it would go up and down a little bit and then cut off. And people were freaking out, which is not reasonable, because you'll get similar effects with just audio bouncing off of adjacent surfaces. Like cancellation effects are quite possible to hear past, but people were very concerned about that. Same deal with cutoffs of low passes and high passes, and whether it's going to transition from one to the other, or whether it's going to give a bump. And note this. You can do this. These are roll-offs. Suppose this is high pass, and you have, say, an IIR filter, or indeed a biquad, where you're going up to the frequency point, and then say it's a Butterworth, and so it's going down by, say, 3 dB per octave or something. It's going down by some dB per octave. And you can do another filter like that. And if you run them in series, you run first the one and then another. This one goes into this one. What you get is twice the cutoff without the little bump in the resonant frequency. Or you could make each individual one cut off more steeply by making the resonant peak, making it be steeper than just Butterworth. And if you did that, you'd get an even steeper cutoff and an even bigger bump. So these things can all be added together. You can add them together in series, or you can add them together in parallel to sort of dissipate them a little bit, or combine them. And this is all stuff that you can do with biquads and filtration. You've also got the biquad filter algorithm for bandpass. And bandpass can make this little resonant peak. I'm not sure what the equivalent of a Butterworth bandpass would be. Maybe it's just a sort of round lump where it cuts off, but then it goes smoothly across the center area. And if you do a bandpass, you're getting a kind of a wah-wah effect. And that'll, specify the Q means it will specify how tight this is. You can tighten it up to the point where it's just like this little laser-like flange sounding thing that brings out only harmonics and it's almost totally quiet. If you're using just the biquad algorithms on a bandpass filter, what you will get out of running a bandpass is this, that the amplitude is going to be about the same as the regular music, but the steeper the resonance of the bandpass, the more the other sounds just drop away into silence. Meaning that you can take it and each of these can sort of be swapped for each other. Like you can take this and subtract it from the audio and get that. Or you can take the bandpass, steepen it with the resonance, and subtract that, the output of that, from the raw signal and get the notch. And the notch is the same thing. Like if you make it very, very steep, you wind up having something where you can't hardly hear the sound of it at all, because it's nothing but taking out just one tightly, you could do a hum canceller by deciding that 60 hertz is the sample, the frequency that you want to remove, and then you make a notch using a biquad, and you make the notch really, really steep, and it'll take the 60 hertz out very accurately. Or you can have a much gentler notch, and with that you start getting just a real frequency cut out of it. And it all works in this, it's a bit like in 3D modeling, they call it constructive solid geometry, where you can make a thing that's a box, or you can make a thing that's a sphere, and you can make a thing that is like the intersection of a box and a sphere, meaning it could be half of a sphere, or it could be a box with a spherical hole cut out of it. And it's kind of like that with these. Like you can make anything out of these biquad shapes. And one of the things that I chose not to implement so much, you can also do biquads where it's like, here is this frequency, and then it's this cutoff, the resonance does this, if even, because I think some of the calculations here leave the resonance out for that. And then this is the altered frequency. You tell it a boost or cut amount, and it'll do a shelf. It'll do a high shelf or a low shelf. And my personal feeling about that is I'd rather do it with these primitives. I would rather do it with just pure high passes, low passes, notches, peaks, because that's basically what this is built out of. And this is just a more complicated algorithm to do the same thing that you would get if you just had like your, I guess that'd be a low pass, your low pass, and then a dry wet control. Besides, the thing about low passes and dry wet controls is that you can make and I've done this before. Say this would be a 3-band EQ implemented kind of the same way that it is in C-Strip or my EQ plugin. But my EQ plugin can't do a steepness of bands like this biquad-based stuff does. My EQ plugin and C-Strip are very gentle curves and very gradual kind of things, but they have this advantage in that what I've got going on in C-Strip and EQ, I think I have two poles of like first order IIR filter, which are actually interleaved. My stuff looks more like this. Very gradual roll-offs. So if you take this mid-band down, what you get is a very gradual transition and an EQ effect. And you can do this again with that sort of constructive solid geometry behavior, where you take a high pass and you go, okay, here's my high pass. This is going to be my raw high frequency sound. I'll take this first because the less processing I do to the highs, the better, because I think they're going to be more delicate. And then what we've got here, you take the raw signal, the dry signal, subtract the high pass, and then you got this. And then what you do is to add them together so that if they're at equal levels, you get the original back, is you add the dry signal and the high pass together, and you get the original sound coming out. And you can do that in such a way where it's literally bit identical. Like, implemented correctly, at a high enough resolution, the amount of processing that you do to do it means nothing. Because everything is either the filtered thing or the inverse of the filtered thing. You know, the one subtracted from dry or whatever. And then if you add the thing and the inverse of the thing together again, you're going to get the original sound out no matter what was involved in making these filter bands. So here's the thing. If you do this, and you can make this be, highs and then everything else, you take this out, now you've got a filtered everything else. If you filter that and have it be mids and then everything else, same deal. You can keep doing this subtraction technique to get to something where you've got a series of bands, and you can work with them as bands. You can apply distortions and things to them, and then still be able to add them together for utterly, completely pristine sound with not a single bit out of place, no matter what resolution you're using. You could be long double, and it still isn't going to be any different. Simply because it's just, that and the inverse of it, you add them together and you get it back. And that also means that if you're doing tiny, tiny adjustments, and this holds for even if you have very steep angles too, you could have a 31 band EQ that sounded perfect. Perfect, 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 no tone to it whatsoever. Simply by doing this technique and having it be, subtraction, the constructive solid geometry technique of every step of the way, it's the band that you've done and the inverse of the band that you've done. Add them together, you get the original thing out, and then take one of the bands in between, and this actually holds for crazy filter things like this. You can make the high frequency band out of a resonance that is so steep that it makes an enormous peak. And then you subtract that from the remaining, and what you wind up with is, I'm not sure quite what the picture would be. But even if you have some kind of crazy resonant peak, if you take that and you subtract it from the dry signal is going to have the inverse of that resonant peak also baked in. And then when you add them together, you get flat. You don't get the resonant peak at all. Instead, what's going to happen is if you took away everything else, then you'd have the resonant peak and presumably some kind of funky abstraction down here. And if you removed the high frequency peak, you'd have a low frequency area with some kind of funky thing around the edges there. And then adding them together gets you literally the full resolution thing without any kind of artifact or any other weirdness to it at all. What that means is you can define bands as tightly as you want. Again, like 31 band EQ, 502 band EQ if you want. And have them all sum together to literal perfection. Mathematically no difference from just the dry signal. It is effectively the dry signal. And then duck out one of the frequency bands just a tiny bit. And what's going to happen is you'll have just a tiny bit of attenuation, very tightly defined, and just a tiny hint of whatever weird resonant thing you had going on. Because, dry is dry. If it's all flat, you could do that with more bands. Good question. And that means it becomes possible to do a really detailed EQ that could really grab onto particular frequency ranges. And by the same token, you can adjust the frequencies of these if you wanted. You could have it be like, okay, my mid-frequency has a resonant peak at its top range. So it gets this particular color if I'm boosting. And it'd be flat, but as soon as you started cranking on a little bit of boost, your boost shape would start looking like this. And you could do a boost shape that looked like that, where it would be tightly contained within an area, and then you'd have your area of boost, and then at the top end of the area of boost, you'd start getting an additional amount of mojo going on, where it would top out at a really sharp point, and then it'd be a really sharp slope. And then if you turned it back down, flat, not a problem. So this is kind of what I've got in mind with regarding Airwindows biquads. And remember, you can do all of that within the context of a console algorithm. Which console algorithm? All console algorithms. Notably, the one that's coming out is going to use Console 5 internally, because Console 5 is the one based on sines and is cleaner. And it also has simpler math, like the input stuff coming in is just a sine function. And then the output stuff, you do have to make sure that the output doesn't go over 1 or -1. So it is capable of clipping, but also the output is just an arcsine. So the one that's coming out is using Console 5. That is not to say that you can't use Console 6, for instance. Console 6 is going to be more distorty. It's going to still behave much the same, but when you start using Console 6 for a Airwindows biquad implementation, it's going to be dirtier. And I fooled with it. I tried it. You can try it yourself, because remember, typical DAW channel EQs are biquad based. So if you've got Logic channel EQ, if you've got like Reaper presumably or something like that, get anything where you are setting frequencies and resonant frequency and Q is basically what you're looking for. And high passes, low passes, band passes are probably how they're implementing things like boosts and cuts. And you do that kind of thing. And then sandwich that with console instances. You could use Console 5, and here kind of what I'll be making, although remember my biquad is using long doubles for all of its coefficients, so it is more resilient to like steep resonances and things. And probably cleaner in the general audio band. But you can hear what some of this stuff is going to sound like in general terms by simply putting Console 4 DAW EQ, console channel DAW EQ console bus in a chain like that. And you can do that with Console 6 to hear what it'll sound like when some of your boosts and cuts and things get a little more distorty. It is And then David Pixley can use not DRes, ULaw, which is an even more aggressive form of doing things, and that'll be an enormous big mess. Because if you're using ULaw, then anything you do here is going to probably cause really crazy effects, which is not to say we can't design plugins. Like one that I just designed this morning, in fact, is I'm going to call it Interstage. And it's like I've been asked to do a decent DC blocker, and I'm going to be able to do that. I have an idea for another plugin that's using the biquads to do it, which is a distinct but I think equally worthy sound. That said, I have one that is going to come out that is called Interstage, and it's my original school of EQ designs. It's like interleaved IIRs and things, and it's using a way of doing several bands of the IIR filters and some slew limiting, and it's slew limiting based on the a slightly pre-filtered effect. And the end result is that it models essentially the sounds of going between stages in analog hardware. It's like just a hint of high frequency restriction from slew rate. It's just a hint of interstage coupling capacitor, but it's designed in such a way that it actually brings the low bass out a teeny bit, which is weird because you'd think that putting a filter in like that would cause it to roll off bass instead, but the way that I set it up, it kind of cuts DC voltages out a little bit, but not really as much as you'd think. Different kind of filter type. And the transition band is such that it brings a little bit of a reshaping, a little bit of a boost to the very lowest frequencies. So basically I'll be coming out with a plugin that uses equalization factors to not really change the sound very much, but just kind of reshape everything. And it's called Interstage because it's designed to be able to be used between anything, like literally everything that you could want. If you want to put it between every plugin that you've got, that's fine too. If you want to, put one on the end of channels and then put one in the middle of a console, and you put one in the middle of the submixes, and then you put one in the beginning of the master bus, and then put one at the end of the master bus, you can do that too. It is real flexible as far as letting you go bonkers with it and throw as many of them as you want. All that'll happen is everything will start getting a little bit more band limited, a little bit more analog-y step by step. And it's another one of those plugins that has no controls. Interstage calculates the frequency rate and stuff, so it does adapt itself, and it adapts the slew rate stuff. But it's doing so little that I designed it and tested it by instantiating like 6 of them in a row. And when I demonstrate it and put it out, I'll be doing that. I'll be going like, okay, here's what this sounds like. You probably didn't hear the difference. Maybe you did. And the way this works is to put it anywhere you want. Kind of like channel, but it's a little more subtle than channel. And so here is what it sounds like when you run through 6 of them in a row. Because that's the same thing as running through plugins in series, which is one of the ways you can do biquads, is have the plugin, have the biquad, and then have another biquad and run through them both in a row, and you get the doubled up effect. If you run through multiple instances of Interstage, you'll double up that effect to a point, but it's also slightly nonlinear, so it doesn't just exacerbate things. And you could also put it in, you could put spiral in there as well. There's no reason you can't. And here's the thing. The reason I brought that up, because now it is just about 1 o'clock, so it's time for me to go and I think have a snack. I'm hungry. Because we're doing Airwindows biquads implemented this way, and the reason I implemented it this way is I can say low pass 9, and then put it in my code. It's very simple and easy to get around. It doesn't take up a lot of space, and that contains all its own variables. So you can just have it as a little chunk. You put this little chunk of code in your code, and there's your low pass. It's good to go. You can do that for any number of different things. You'd have a bunch of different sections, each of which are a different EQ building block, and they will look and act like building blocks in the code and be very approachable in that way. But if you're doing something like Interstage, where it's like, here's your console, here's some biquad stuff that we're doing in the middle, here's the bus, and since it's like Interstage, it doesn't have controls, you could also go, here's a ULaw encode, here's a biquad, here is ULaw decode, and we're going to tell the biquad just to do something very, very subtle. We'll do the biquad in such a way that it's barely doing anything, or that it's carefully, what it's doing is very controlled. And then if you only set it to a very small amount of whatever it's doing, and you can do things like tell the biquad, this is a secret, but more will be revealed. If you tell a biquad bandpass to have a resonance of like 0.000000001, what you get is this. It rolls off before 0 hertz and before the Nyquist frequency. This is what a wide open bandpass looks like. I will tell you, since I don't think other people are doing this very much, because it doesn't occur to them that that would be special, this still blocks DC. It looks kind of like a weird rectangular block. It'll let through the audio virtually untouched. You really won't hear much in the way, but since it is a biquad bandpass, this is band limiting. You can keep turning the resonance up and it comes back together again and then becomes this tight little band like a wah pedal. And then you turn it back down into it's almost nothing, and it's still blocking DC because DC is not a frequency. And it's still blocking Nyquist because Nyquist is not a permissible frequency. Which means that, and this one's going to be called like isolation rather than interstage. I can also make a interstage style, like this sounds like an analog stage, out of one biquad bandpass. And that's going to be a lot of fun. And if I do that, I have yet to experiment with whether it sounds better using console and console bus, or whether I need to do one which is a DC blocker that's just set to block at like 2 hertz or something, and doesn't use console because most of it is going to be not touching the sound at all, and the quality boost you would get from that would be from using the long doubles, using enough resolution that it can handle such extreme settings. But yeah, there are many exciting things coming in Airwindows land as I start playing with this stuff, because again, like I showed you, we can do these things, and it seemed logical for people to be like, let's do one where you can specify the boost frequency and then it is a high shelf or a low shelf. And that's fine, but if they're doing that, they're not doing the assembling stuff out of overlapping, canceling out things that'll get you the raw signal back. And they're not thinking of stuff like this. They're not thinking of what happens to the algorithm when you just open up the resonance so much that it behaves really strangely. And you can see that in some of the calculators, where you tell the calculator, like, give me this frequency and this resonance, and it'll draw it on a little screen. You get those, and you start playing with the sliders and things and go, oh, hey, when I turned the resonance all the way down, it just spread out until it looked like it was flat, and then the corners still turned down to silence because it's still a bandpass. It's all really interesting stuff. You know, I'll tell you something else interesting, which is going to affect isolation. Isolation very well might not be a faceless plugin, or there might be several of them. If you do something like this by widening out the resonance so much by turning the resonance down to 0.00000001 or whatever, and then you move the frequency, like rather than being literally in the middle, move it up to the high frequencies or down to the low frequencies, you start getting a tilt control. And you start getting one where the high frequencies are generally a little brighter or the low frequencies predominate. You can make it darker, you can make it lighter, all with one stage of bandpass, one stage of biquad bandpass, which again can be run within the console system. So we're going to have some very cool sounding stuff, especially for people who like analog style sounds that aren't like too digital or anything like that. It's general broad stroke washes of color or changing tones of things. There's a lot of stuff that I've done that I can now do a lot better. So it's going to be exciting times. And with that, and Joko, yes, absolutely. Yep, we can do a Tilt EQ. Might be better than the current Tilt EQ, because I do have a Tilt EQ, I think, but I think what I'll be able to do will blow it away, because what I'll be able to do with that also has a built-in DC block and a built-in near Nyquist roll-off as if it was an analog piece of gear. So it'll be simultaneously a Tilt EQ and an analog simulator, all at the same time. And I could build distortion into it, and U-Law, and who knows what. So yeah. So on that note, I'm going to go off and have lunch of some kind. But I will talk to you guys later. And I'm probably going to be using this odd little device that I'm pointing to for the Tuesday thing. So I didn't use the Kurzweil last time, because it's a Rompler. That's a virtual analog thingy from, it's a Yamaha AN200. I'm going to see whether I can do some kind of trancey-like thing tomorrow with the new lights and everything, and use that as sort of like pads or synths or things. And the colored papers are just presets that I can use for that. So yeah. So I will talk to you guys later, and Biquad comes out next week. So next Sunday, keep an eye out, because it's going to be one of your Airwindows primitive, simplest version thing where the frequency just goes from 0 to 1, and that's from like nothing to near Nyquist. I've set it up so that it doesn't actually break, because if you literally give the algorithm 0 or 1, it dies. But I've constrained it so that you can get very close to the most extreme possible settings, and you can get very steep resonances. And I have an inverse wet dry in there as well. And yeah, that's next week. You'll get a what's called Biquad, and it'll be just a little test bed. There'll be a selection between the first 4 types. I'm leaving off the shelf type because you're effectively doing that with the dry wet. And yeah. So on that note, talk to you later.